This is most probably where you belong. You're part of the 99%, and this is where the 1% belongs. The amount of wealth owned by the top 1% around the world is almost 50% of the total global wealth. But there is something interesting to note. If you pay close attention to this chart, that wasn't always the case. In the beginning of the previous century, this number was more or less the same. Then it dropped, and then it went up again. So instead of progressing towards a more egalitarian society, where the wealth is distributed fairly amongst its citizens, we regress to a point where wealth inequality is the same as it was almost 100 years ago. What exactly happened? What caused our societies to improve and then to deteriorate? This is what I will try to find out with this video. I'm going to delve into the history of inequality, analyze what happened in the 20th century, and propose solutions inspired by the most important people in the field of inequality. So, zone out, remove all distractions, and let's go back in time. This is the anatomy of inequality. Let's start with something very crucial. Human progress exists. It exists and is closely related to freedom. As the great philosopher Georg Hegel wrote, history is the progress of the consciousness of freedom. Throughout history, the most defining human characteristic has been our pursuit of freedom. We started living in tribes. Tribes were mostly egalitarian. But one event changed everything: the advent of agriculture. When our ancestors invented agriculture, that set in motion a chain of consequences that would shape the world in a very particular direction. Farming made our ancestors become attached to their land. Private property was invented, and with that, the need for ownership. Agriculture, however, allowed people to have easier access to food, and that made life easier. What happened next is that populations boomed. Villages became towns. Towns became cities. Cities became countries. As populations continued to grow, fueled by this new energy, human life began to change. As people started living in communities, they had to create new rules and ways of behaving, working together more closely. As these communities and economies expanded, they became harder to manage. To deal with this, humans made laws to control behavior and established systems of authority to make sure everyone followed these rules. This led to the birth of the first hierarchical societies where a king or emperor was at the top, in charge of everyone else. But knowing the laws isn't the same thing as obeying them. Emperors and kings needed people to accept their authority, and the most effective way was through religion. King Hammurabi, for instance, justified his rule by claiming the gods had chosen him to govern Mesopotamia. If people believed their ruler was selected by divine will, they were more likely to accept the rule. This is a common practice amongst humans. We are the only animal that can share stories about things that exist only in our imagination. Things like money, gods, and states. By collectively embracing these shared myths, we can come together in large groups and work towards common goals. A myth is the glue that binds societies together. Throughout the years, different myths tended to dominate different areas of the world. But in the Western world, things started to change during a period called the Renaissance. Generally described as taking place from the 14th century to the 17th century, the Renaissance promoted the rediscovery of classical philosophy, literature, and art. When people think more, they start to question more, and thus they started to question dominant narratives of the time.
Really, with what I get from these peasants, I can hardly afford to pay my perfume bills. What about Roulet? Has he paid his rent?
Roulet died last week.
Died with his rent unpaid. Oh, what did he die of?
Hunger.
Hunger is an indulgence with these peasants. Oh, I keep forgetting, Gabelle, you're a humanitarian, aren't you? You think that one person is as good as another. A naive notion so contradicted by the facts.
So revolution started. The French Revolution, for instance, was one of the most important revolutions in history. People realized that the rulers are not omniscient and that the ruling system was far from fair. The revolutionary ideas of liberty, equality, and fraternity led to the abolition of the absolute monarchy, the rise of the First French Republic, and radical social changes. The only issue was that the people were not really well prepared for such radical changes. Equality cannot occur organically or spontaneously. We need political institutions and a system in place that can gradually transition society into its next evolutionary stage. This didn't really happen in France, so things started to regress into anarchy. The revolution's initial radical phase gave way to more conservative phases and power shifts. The 19th century was essentially the century where the monarchs realized that they need to establish a balance of power among European nations, redraw borders, and prevent the resurgence of revolutionary movements. The advent of the technological revolution boosted capitalism and allowed it to become the most dominant economic system the world has ever known. All kinds of commodities were made with machines. They were made faster, they were standardized, and they could yield more profit. Individuals who had access to capital were capable of accumulating vast amounts of wealth simply by selling their products, keeping the profits and reinvesting them. Capital was transformed into a powerful tool that could perpetually expand. This chart highlights the wealth inequality in Europe in the 19th century. As you can see, throughout the 19th century, the top 10% of the population owned more than 80% of the wealth. However, the 20th century marks the beginning of a very special period for mankind. Nationalism is on the rise and competition between European countries is intense. That leads to the First World War. During the period of imperialism, countries were engaged in fierce competition with each other over territorial expansion and trade routes. The British Empire was among the most powerful nations at the time, and Germany in particular wanted a piece of the cake. It's important to note that the reasons behind wars are often a combination of political and economic factors. The elites are aware that wars provide opportunities for businesses and wealth redistribution. As a result, they may push governments to engage in wars. Additionally, when inequality is high, social tensions are on the rise, and a good war is the greatest distraction of all. After the First World War, a new idea arises. Governments are bankrupt, people have no money to pay taxes, so the only way to get money is by taxing the aristocracy. So we see the beginning of the drop in aristocratic power. When the power of the aristocracy drops, the power of the working class rises. The idea that the working class needs to put up with the way the system works was completely overturned in the 20s. And then came the Great Depression. People realized that capitalism is no bed of roses. In fact, it is an extremely flawed system that needs to be regulated, otherwise it will lead to chaos. Throughout history, the great revolutions emerge when a failed system creates such a strong trauma to the people that they cannot take it anymore. That happened after the Great Depression, and people started to demand radical changes. Changes were made as politicians realized that without enough wealth redistribution and social support, basic social stability would be at risk. Then comes World War II. The Germans, after having to pay huge reparations, face social instability, and the Nazi movement takes advantage of it. The war spurred unprecedented levels of industrial production, setting the stage for post-war economic growth. The aftermath of World War II saw the restructuring of the global economic order. The war had a profound impact on the balance of economic power, with the United States emerging as a major industrial and economic force. The social landscape in the aftermath of World War II changes completely. People earn more rights like pension, health insurance, sickness pay, holiday pay, and maternity leave. There is a clear vision that capital needs to help the people. The free market narrative is being challenged all around the world. Progressive taxation and social welfare programs were adopted, which contributed significantly to the decline in wealth concentration. For 30 years, the growth was tremendous. People could improve their standard of living and save money to buy a house and acquire capital. During the 60s, we have social justice movements that start to rise and put pressure on governments to give more rights to different social groups. The middle class is quite strong, well educated, and this leads to a more egalitarian society. But in the 80s, things start to change. Globalization made the world essentially one market, and many countries started to rise in the global setting. In the United States and the UK, there was a feeling that the rest of the world was catching up, and their domination wasn't as strong as it used to be. So a new narrative started to emerge. The welfare system has made us weak. The rest of the world is catching up. We need to change. We need to become stronger. We need to become great again.
For those without skills, we'll find a way to help them get new skills. For those without job opportunities, we'll stimulate new opportunities, particularly in the inner cities where they live. For those who've abandoned hope, we'll restore hope and we'll welcome them into a great national crusade to make America great again.
It's a new form of capitalistic nationalism that actually works. People are willing to give up their rights just to feel that their national identity becomes stronger. It's a lie that governments like to tell to increase the power of businesses and reduce the power of workers. And people started adopting the mantra, greed is good, and stopped questioning it.
The point is, ladies and gentlemen, that greed, for lack of a better word, is good. Greed is right. Greed works.
The era of unrestrained free market capitalism has started. Bankers began to get paid more, market forces were unleashed, capitalists became a lot richer. The main proposal, instigated by Ronald Reagan in the United States and Margaret Thatcher in the UK, was that of trickle-down economics. The core idea is that by cutting taxes on the rich and reducing regulations, the wealth generated at the top will trickle down to the rest of the population through increased investment, job creation, and overall economic growth. Essentially, they thought that by favoring the rich, the pie would become bigger and the rest of the people would get a small percentage of a bigger pie. But even this small part of the pie is not available to everyone. It was a social myth that keeps perpetuating till today, and thus we experience the return of the aristocrats in a different shape and form. Huge multinationals that are monopolizing specific markets are capable of generating a small class of extremely wealthy individuals. Essentially, we experience a return to the status quo that was prevalent in the beginning of the previous century. And that's not the only problem. Extremely wealthy individuals are not just good at influencing politics, they're also really good at hiding their wealth. They find tax havens, they establish trusts, and employ sophisticated financial structures to obscure the true extent of their assets and income. In a nutshell, the aristocracy isn't just back, it is back and stronger than ever. I mentioned in the beginning of the video that throughout history, the most defining human characteristic is our pursuit of freedom. Freedom is at the epicenter of our experience. When we're free, we experience the world better, we feel comfortable in our own skin, and we coexist better with others. Inequality is the antithesis of freedom. Inequality creates classes and division between people. Classes shouldn't be the norm in societies. Classes are a social myth to keep people subjugated. The most relevant historical example of a class-related problem is the caste system. A caste system is one of the oldest, systematized and institutionalized forms of oppression. Let's work with the example of Mexico. Prior to the arrival of the Spanish, Mexico's population was fairly uniform. After colonization, the Mexican population changed drastically, as there were approximately 6 million inhabitants in what was once called New Spain. Of this population, 60,000 were individuals of Spanish descent who hailed from Spain, while 940,000 were individuals of Spanish descent who were born in the territories. This demographic shift had a profound impact on Mexico's social, class, and racial structures. Here is a painting that depicts 16 different racial groupings in Mexico in the 18th century. The caste system was a complex racial and biological hierarchy that did not allow for social mobility. The restraint of social mobility served as a way for the rulers to control the population better. If you're convinced that you are born in a specific caste and that's where you belong your whole life, your ability to pursue individual freedom is reduced dramatically. In modern societies, mostly in the West, caste systems do not exist. The thing is that we still believe in hierarchies. We still define the quality of a person by their social and economic status, and the capitalistic narrative reinforces that. We let our guards down and surrender to a system that thrives on bragging, on greed, and on competition. Not just any competition, the unhealthiest competition of all. A competition that damages the social fabric and creates more friction between us. We do not coexist anymore. We just exist. We exist in a common place and in a common system that feeds off our inability to unite and face the common enemy. It feeds off inequality. Moreover, inequality creates poverty. As Peter Joseph writes in his seminal work, The New Human Rights Movement, modern poverty is actually not an inevitable byproduct of humans sharing a planet that is supposedly deficient in resources. Rather, poverty today is a systemic consequence native to our current economic mode. This graph shows the amount of people at risk of poverty in the EU. The average is at 20%, which is insanely high if we consider the level of progress that we have made as societies. Mohandas Gandhi has famously said, "Poverty is the worst form of violence." This implicitly criticizes the existence of class inequality and its systemic effects. Finally, inequality goes hand in hand with extremism. When inequality is high, it is also palpable. People are not stupid, they can feel it, but they're also confused. Inequality makes people insecure, unsafe, and pushes them to cling to things that they deem as more stable. Things like their national identity, a religion, an extremist group. This creates more and more tension. This tension somehow needs to be released. The more attractive alternatives are usually the more extreme, the more loud alternatives. These alternatives focus on a singular enemy, a singular other that they deem as the source of their misery, and they lash out to them in an extreme and violent fashion. Inequality is a very complex problem. Complex problems require a lot of thought and systems in place that will challenge conventional narratives in an attempt to disrupt outdated patterns of thought. But most of the time, new ideas face backlash because of people who want to conserve the status quo. People who are taking advantage of human psychology and manage to convince us that we should be satisfied with what we have and that we do not deserve more. This is the story of propaganda, and it works quite well. World history is full of propaganda stories that societies tell to justify their inequality. So becoming aware of the mechanisms of propaganda and the interests they serve is the first step. Then we need to analyze different solutions that are proposed by sincere and hardworking people in the fields of economics and systems development. One of them is the famous economist Thomas Piketty, who is a pioneer in the field of inequality. His books, Capital in the 21st Century and Capital and Ideology, revolutionized the research on inequality and brought the issue of inequality back into the global dialogue. According to Piketty, inequality is a political choice. It is something societies opt for, not the inevitable outcome of technology and globalization. Also, inequality is connected to history, and history is a battle of ideas. If we look at the data of the great redistribution of the period between 1914 and 1980, the main lesson is the following. The welfare state and progressive taxation are powerful tools that allow us to transform capitalism. For instance, there was a period between 1940 and 1960 where the top federal income tax rate for high-income individuals in the United States was 94%. During the same period, the wealth concentration of the top 1% was at a record low of around 30%. Progressive income taxation reduced wealth inequality substantially. Apart from an income tax, a wealth tax is another interesting proposal that could be standardized. Currently, the tax system is based on the realization principle, which means that individuals are required to sell something before paying income tax on the gains from ownership. This also means that capital gains taxes are only owed on stocks after they have been sold, allowing individuals to delay taxes by holding onto their stocks without selling them. A wealth tax would be similar to property taxes, where you owe the tax each year based on the market value of your home. The difference is that the wealth tax would apply to all property, real estate, cash, investments, business ownership, and other assets. Additionally, companies could pay taxes depending on their global sales. If a multinational makes 50 million in global profits each year and 10% of its worldwide sales are in France, then France could say that 10% of the company's profit should be taxed in France. Now let's say that all these tax measures work and the governments make more money from the rich. Then what? How do we ensure that the money gets redistributed fairly to the rest of the population? Piketty suggests many ideas, some of them quite radical. First is the idea of basic income. A basic income is a social welfare proposal in which all citizens of a given population regularly receive a minimum income in the form of an unconditional payment each month. The aim of a basic income system is to reduce poverty and replace other social programs that may require greater bureaucratic involvement. According to Piketty, the modest amount envisaged for the basic income is generally between half and 3/4 of the minimum wage. Alongside basic income, another proposal is that of inheritance redistribution. Hyperconcentration of property is a fundamental issue. In particular, the poorest 50% have almost never had any substantial possessions. The most natural way of escaping this would be to imagine a system of inheritance redistribution that enabled everyone to receive a minimal inheritance. For example, this minimal inheritance could be equal to 60% of the average wealth per adult paid to each person at the age of 25. For instance, 120,000 euros if the average is on the order of 200,000 euros as it currently is in France. This capital endowment could be financed by a combination of a progressive tax on wealth and on inheritances, levying approximately 5% of the national income. The primary objective of an inheritance for all is to increase the negotiating power of everyone who owns almost nothing. If you have nothing, or worse yet, if you have only debts, then you must accept whatever wages and working conditions you can get, or almost. Basic income is a valuable tool for changing the situation and rebalancing power dynamics, but unfortunately, it does not suffice. Having 100,000 or 200,000 euros or dollars as a complement to basic income, guaranteed employment, and all the rights associated with the most extensive welfare state possible changes the situation substantially. But we must also explain that redistribution of property alone is not enough to transcend capitalism. If the objective were simply to replace large property owners with small and middle-sized property owners who are just as greedy and careless with the social and environmental consequences of their actions, then it would be of limited interest. These are all ideas. As Thomas Piketty has written, the march toward equality is a battle whose outcome is uncertain and not a road laid out in advance. Since the end of the 18th century, equality has made its way by overturning the rules established by the regimes in power. The same will be true in the future. Also, ideas can always be tested in smaller scales before they can be adopted. We create new cities. We can even create new countries that can adopt certain principles for a post-capitalism era. The most important thing is to keep the discussion going and educate ourselves. And that's what I endeavor to do with this channel. Before we close, one more thing. It takes time and a lot of effort and resources to make these videos. If you find my content interesting and valuable, you can support me by joining my Patreon. In exchange, you'll get access to my Discord server, where I like to hang out, my personal newsletter, video transcripts, your name in the credits, and many more perks available at different tiers. Again, thanks for watching. See you in the next one.